All right. Well, it is time to finish this book. Surprisingly, I read through chapter 16, and I was like, "Man, this is really short. Maybe I should do 17." And then 17 is the last chapter, so we're cutting it out early. All right. So, Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread, chapter 16, the decentralization of industry. Kropotkin begins by walking through the process of industrialization of Europe: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Poland, Italy, Hungary. He moves on to Mexico and India. He's using this as some kind of example of like how industry naturally decentralizes, but what it really is, what we're really seeing here, is the gradual spread of private property and capital goods. Each such move, every time that there was a new factory built in a new country, it required real savings and investment. And that savings and investment had to come from somewhere, some existing wealth. The capital goods had to be produced, and not only that, what capital goods to produce needed to be determined. Prices, markets, and private property ease this process as opposed to simply some, production general saying, make this, make this, make this. In the absence of secure private property, most of this investment probably wouldn't have happened, right? You would have had these places kind of go on in their highly totalitarian, controlled economies, and they would have made very little progress. We've seen over time that as the control of the economy lessens by the government, that people generally figure things out better and become more productive. But one additional point about this particular aspect is that much of this investment was paired with innovation that would have been much less likely to happen without prices, markets, and private property rights, right? The central planner, right? If you asked a central planner in the early 1900s what people wanted, they would have said faster horses. But the joke answer, of course, is that Henry Ford was like, well, no, let's make something that isn't a horse at all. Let's make a new thing. I mean, I realize that I'm playing a little bit fast and loose with history there, but the quote, I think, is indicative of something that is not generally going to be present in government functionaries. The bureaucracy is going to say, well, we this is how we do things. They're going to have a book of rules, and they're going to say, this is how we do things, and this is how we're going to continue to do things. And generally speaking, they will be less receptive to the possibilities of innovation, especially if that innovation entails some risk, which it usually does. Moving on with Kropotkin, he moves on to special industries like silk. Industries that used to be focused in one country have spread to other countries. He states this as if it's some kind of surprise. He concludes that this is the end of specialization. Quote, "The specialization of which economists spoke so highly enriched a number of capitalists, but is now of no use." End quote. Kropotkin is completely misunderstanding the concept of specialization here. In fact, each of these special industries uses a set of capital goods and labor skills which is extremely specialized. He appears to be mistaking specialization by location with specialization by person or task or process. Just to go further, he gives the example of silk. Dyeing is a specialization, that is, coloring silk cloth, right? Working a loom is a specialization. Cultivating silkworms is a specialization. Extracting unbroken silk threads from cocoons is a specialization. Sewing is a specialization. Creating patterns for the cutting of cloth to make clothing is a specialization. And each of these specializations is in turn reliant on specializations further upstream. For some more examples, producing dyes, that is actually mixing the chemicals, is not the same thing as using the dyes, how much to use, how long to soak them, all kinds of little bits of information like that. Working a loom is not the same thing as building a mechanical loom. Cultivating silkworms is not the same thing as building habitats for silkworms. Sewing is not needle making, nor is it, the processing of iron ore into steel, etc. There's a million examples of this. This is just a few that I thought of, just kind of in passing about the silk industry. I'm sure I'm missing a lot. This is not to say that people can't engage in more than one specialization, but rather it's to say that each additional specialization that a person takes on will require some additional expenditure of resources for training, and additional resources for the capital goods that they're going to use. Learning more specializations becomes easier if overall wealth levels are higher. Failure to train can result in a lot of wasted resources or longer terms taken to produce a given good. Even a fairly, a task that on the surface feels like a fairly simple task, right? Like milking a cow. The first time you do it, you're probably going to be a lot slower, and you're going to miss the canister a lot more, right? Alternatively, if you have a milking machine, you're going to have to know how to attach it without harming the cow. You're going to need to know how to operate, whatever goofy thing it has to control it, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very strange misunderstanding for Kropotkin to make. He's like, well, Russia started making silk, or France started making silk, and it's like, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean that specialization went away. It means that specialization happened to more people in more places, not that specialization vanished. Very nonsensical. And he's kind of married to this labor exploitation theory of labor, and it's hurting his arguments in a significant way. Kropotkin then proceeds to argue that it is nonsensical to export higher order goods and import consumer goods or goods of lower orders. An example he gives is to export wool and to import cloth. Failing to develop processing industries leaves the, quote, industrial and technical capacities, end quote, of a nation, quote, undeveloped, end quote. Okay, there's actually an element of truth to this, but as usual, Kropotkin is ignoring the problem of scarcity. It makes sense on some level that, hey, it'd be, buying a bunch of silk clothing is going to cost us a lot of, raw silk in order to actually buy that clothing. In theory, we're going to have to sell the silk to make the clothing and sell the silk to pay for the labor of the person who makes the clothing, stuff like that. The problem is that the investments needed to build the factories and other capital goods that are needed to convert these higher order goods to lower order, that is closer to the consumer goods, are often beyond the ability of some countries to pay at some given time. Given saving and investment, they can build those things up, but it may be that there's some group of people that really only are good at, cultivating silk, but they don't have the machinery needed to turn it into cloth on a large scale. If they're really, really good at making silk, then it would make sense for them to sell their silk in order to get clothes back. But it would be on them to basically save up over time in order to, pay for the training and the capital goods that are needed to make it so that they're self-sufficient in this sense. That's something that has to happen over time. You can't just will it into existence. To give a silly example, imagine there was a Stone Age island society somewhere, and they're just kind of barely getting into the Bronze Age stuff, right? Say that like the plan for an MRI machine and a sales brochure lands on their beach one day, and miraculously they're able to read it, right? The language that it's written in just by coincidence is the same as the language they speak. It would make very little sense for them to spend time trying to build the MRI machines if they're all rather than the thing that they're already specialized at and can do. Which would be mining copper ore or something like that, right? Later on, they might be able to get all of the stuff that they need to build an MRI machine, but it would make very little sense for them to put a bunch of time and effort into this non-productive thing where they don't even have most of the stuff that they need to make it at this point. And it may even be that if they're mining a little bit of copper and a little bit of iron and a little bit of glass to make silicon, right? Or sand to make silicon, they still might not have the technical know-how or the free time to build the MRI machines rather than do the things that they're already specialized at. Everybody would love to live in an area and a time where all these methods of production are already fully capitalized, fully roundabout, productivity is already maximal. However, the only way to get there is by saving and investing in capital goods. There's no shortcut that you have there. So, it'd be great if you could just say factory, 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 but Kropotkin's ignoring the fact that you can't just say factory, factory, factory. He then goes on to note that agriculture is highly dependent on an extremely complex network of capital goods. It's maddening because he almost becomes aware for a second, and then it just kind of floats away because he is stuck on other ideas. These complex networks of capital goods wouldn't exist in many of the areas that might start his social revolution. Therefore, it's incorrect to assume that their production will match those of the more highly capitalized zones. Kropotkin goes on. He asks the reader to, quote, imagine the inhabitants of a city or territory, whether vast or small, stepping for the first time onto the path of the social revolution, end quote. Such a move means the end of international commerce, paralysis in the circulation of goods, and a need for self-sufficiency. This is autarky rearing its ugly head again. It's beyond question that a small group, formerly getting large quantities of expensive goods in exchange for, say, accounting services, right? Pizza delivery. If they decide to suddenly become farmers and make those expensive goods themselves, they would find a drastic decrease in their standard of living. The persistent question that Kropotkin never really addresses is, why should anyone maintain or decide to maintain this fallacious view that employment and capital ownership is theft, when the only thing that you get out of such a belief appears to be poverty? Kropotkin continues, noting that 1 million Parisians will lose their export jobs and will have to start farming. He really loves to pretend this thing's going to happen in Paris. The problem with 1 million people who are working in the export industry suddenly having to become farmers is that they have no knowledge of farming. And likely, many of them haven't cultivated a constitution that is suited for heavy manual labor. This is going to go poorly. Kropotkin goes on to explain that intelligent planning will need to be employed in order to maintain production, substitutions of goods, etc. This is, of course, the very common and wrong central planning argument. Centrally planned production will be more intelligent and efficient, despite the lack of signals that make that planning possible. Complex market processes that encourage the creation of layered and deeply roundabout production methods by the transmission of these signals that we call prices. These will suddenly be replaced by these highly fallible memories and deeply flawed understanding of bureaucrats or commune members, however you want to put it. It doesn't really make a difference. They're going to do a bad job. And that's basically chapter 16. So then I hopped into chapter 17, which is longer but makes most of the same mistakes. Let's go through them. Chapter 17 is titled Agriculture. And to start, Kropotkin laments that the political economy pushes the, quote, false principle, end quote, that the only motivator for man is, quote, personal interest in its narrowest sense, end quote. This is the Homo economicus argument, and it's something that's been well known for a long time before Kropotkin. Nobody believes that economic theories that reduce man to such a, mundane puppet are definitely correct. The theories that existed before, say, the marginal revolution, all said, we have these paradoxes, we're trying to figure out how to solve them, but we don't really know. So we're just going to make these theories, and we're going to say that these theories have caveats, but we're not going to throw away things that seem to be at least, somewhat true, somewhat helpful in certain cases. What Kropotkin's basically doing here is a straw man. He's basically attributing this belief to his contemporary economists when nothing could be further from the truth, especially since he came 20 years after the marginal revolution. Kropotkin goes on to suggest that great inventors would burn their designs and break their models if they realized how miserable they would make the workers. Kropotkin, of course, is ignoring that these miserable workers are people who would not have been able to exist for long without those innovations. Capital-intensive production methods increase productivity. They don't decrease it. They make it so that more people can be fed by a given plot of farmland. Kropotkin acknowledges this multiple times. He even acknowledges that the people in the city are building these implements that the farmers use. He just ignores the fact that there was once a time in the past when those tools were either much more primitive or didn't exist at all. And then far fewer bellies could be filled by the produce of his farms. It's like kind of like a Malthusian failing. Is that like, well, population is stable or something like that, when that's not actually the case. The Industrial Revolution was paired with a significant increase in population because more people could be fed by the same amount of farmland or different places that were previously unfarmable could now be farmed. It was necessary to produce the additional food for people to actually survive childhood without starving. This is something Kropotkin appears to be completely ignoring. Kropotkin then argues that the basic principle of economic scarcity is also false, because inventors might be unhappy that workers are unhappy. He makes this weird variety of unrealistic projections about productivity in agriculture, talking about the use of advanced cultivation techniques and methods, greenhouses, artificial fertilizer, etc. He promotes what he calls intensive agriculture, which basically uses the same land over and over again and fixes it every year by pouring in a bunch of fertilizer that is made in some kind of factory somewhere. It develops the land and replenishes any used up nutrients every year. And he contrasts it with what he calls extensive agriculture that basically uses up land and moves on. Now, there's a couple of problems here. Number one, intensive agriculture is highly dependent on capital-intensive processes to ensure that the land does not suddenly fail to produce. If more land is going to be applied to intensive agriculture, then the supporting production must also grow. These factories that are, making farm-ready manure and things like that are going to have to be increased. The people are going to need signals to determine how to apply their additional productivity, if there is any. Kropotkin kind of wipes all this away with his usual myopic utopian gibberish. Also, Kropotkin appears like he might be mistaking extensive agriculture with like the use of fallow cycles. He might be. Because the way he's talking about extensive agriculture, you'd expect like the whole American West to be this stage of failed farm after failed farm after failed farm, when it's not, right? People would farm an area and they would say, well, I don't have enough animals to produce the manure that I need to farm this land, so I'll let it lay fallow for a year or 2 years or whatever, and I'll farm here and then I'll farm here. I mean, crop rotation is a thing that's been going on since medieval times. It's an old technique, and Kropotkin appears to basically be lumping it in here with extensive farming. We're getting close to the end. Kropotkin goes on to talk about making less luxurious toys and working agriculture instead. He goes on to make a bunch of very unrealistic predictions about the productivity of turning Paris and its environs into an agricultural area. He concludes that only about 4 to 5 hours of work per day are needed from everyone to produce more than enough food for everyone. We've gone through how knowledge does not simply jump into the hands of people who are entrusted with farmland. I've cited Robert Conquest's book, Harvest of Sorrow, several times. The people who have specialized in making luxurious toys do so because they are good at making luxurious toys. To expect them to suddenly switch to being farmers and do great their first try is ridiculously and destructively unrealistic. This is what markets are for. If food prices start to increase, what will happen is that people on the margins will be like, oh, I can make more money doing farming? Okay, maybe I'll learn something about farming. I'm going to maintain my career of making luxurious toys, but what I'll do is I'll set aside an hour every night to study, animal husbandry or farming or whatever, plant cultivation. And then, eventually maybe they'll change careers, right? This is something that takes time, though, and it's not something that you can just suddenly cut off everyone from one method of production and then hop them over here and hope that they do well. You'll end up breaking a lot of things and wasting a lot of time and wasting a lot of energy. After that, Kropotkin goes on to once again lump landlords, middlemen, manufacturers, and etc. with state taxation. You can get rid of coercion in theory. That's a thing that you can do, right? Like, most of us live a life where there's not really any coercion in our lives most of the time. We go to the grocery store and we pay for the grocery store stuff. We don't try to steal. The problem is that while you can get rid of coercion in theory, you can't do the same thing with property. Even in the face of the destruction of all deeds to property, there would have to be people who use the property, and use will basically determine ownership in a practical sense. There's no other way that you can do things, right? Again, society can't eat an apple or 100 or 1,000 apples. A person has to eat an apple. 100 people have to eat 100 apples, and so on. Once you eat the apple, it's gone. There's nothing left. And so clearly, the person with final disposition of how it is to be used is the owner, regardless of whether there's a deed or a receipt or something like that. And so, pretending that we can get rid of private property is really just kind of a phantom. We're basically saying, well, we get rid of the deeds that accompany private property, when what the deeds are is their evidence or their ways for people to tell who gets to use what. And so what ends up happening, of course, is you end up with a tragedy of the commons. People use as much as they can, as fast as they can, because they're worried that they won't get another chance. This is kind of what happens in a lot of attempts to make some kind of communal society. This is, why Bernie Sanders gets kicked out of communes, because he doesn't want to actually work. Last point, we're done. And once there is enough for everyone, Kropotkin argues, all will be happy and contented, and there will be no strife. Scarcity is a source of strife, but it is not the only source of strife. There are cases of people who are, who just want to do bad things because they find it enjoyable or fun. Getting rid of scarcity doesn't solve the problem of them, in the same way that the snake was still in the Garden of Eden, right? The snake didn't do what he did, mythologically, because things were scarce in the Garden of Eden. He did what he did because it was something that he found perversely amusing, basically. So it's very funny to me that we've gone through things, and every single time Kropotkin argues that we should just do this thing, it's like, well, there's going to be a lot of costs to that, and he just waves that away. And then when you say, well, we're gonna have a lot more scarcity if this is the case, and he's like, well, eventually we won't, and then everyone will be happy and contented, and there won't be any strife or anger or feuds or rivalries or anything like that anymore. And it's just it's a really nonsensical way to end a book that already is a stack of nonsensical things, one atop the other. Whew. All right, we're done. We're done with Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread. We have observed that there's not much in here. Here's what I'll say. This is not to say that Kropotkin was necessarily like a monster. He wasn't a Lenin or a Stalin. In fact, it's worth noting that when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, Kropotkin was like, this was really, really bad. This is not what I wanted. This is not going to end well either. And so he was, even though he made a lot of really bad arguments that don't make a lot of sense, he still at least was able to look evil in the eye and tell that it was what it was. There's an article that's written by the great Jeff Riggenbach, and I don't remember the title offhand, but I was going to do like a conclusion episode for this, but I don't think it really deserves a conclusion episode. But what I will do is I will direct you to that article by Jeff Riggenbach, where he tries to kind of do a little bit of an apology for Kropotkin. Tries to at least bring out the best parts of Kropotkin as a person. Kropotkin's economics are nonsense. His ideas and thoughts would basically relegate people to subsistence, and many of them to death, if they were actually implemented. Kropotkin argues against coercive tactics or methods in achieving the social revolution, but he does promote the idea of expropriation, which is by its very nature aggressive coercion. So we can't give him a pass because he was a nice guy. But at the same time, we should try to at least distinguish between him and his goofy, stupid utopian ideas, and the people who actually took the idea of getting rid of private property and actually pushed it to its limits in a very authoritarian way. And so we're done with this book. There's clearly not that much. There's clearly very little in here that's worth actually thinking about. The evaluations of Mises and Rothbard that anarcho-communism isn't worth a moment of your time, I'm fairly convinced that they're basically true at this point. Kropotkin has not shown me one iota of evidence that I should follow or believe anything he's saying. At the same time, he wasn't as much of a monster as Lenin and Stalin were, which I guess is, damning with faint praise. But anyway, I'll have that article in the description, so that you can go take a look at that. The stuff I talked about here, the Harvest of Sorrow by Robert Conquest, I've already linked to that in earlier episodes. Maybe I'll link to it again just for the hell of it. But yeah, it's not a good system of thought. Now, what I'll note is that the other two big thinkers in this zone that I know of by name are Proudhon, who was a little bit behind Kropotkin in time. and then Bakunin, who kind of was pushing Kropotkin's ideas, or ideas very much like Kropotkin's, in a much more violent way. I haven't read either of them extensively. I've read a little bit of Proudhon, but not much. Proudhon is the guy that says property is robbery, and there's not a very good case for that. Bakunin is a little bit more of a bomb thrower. But here we're kind of in the middle, where anarcho-communism still is at least pretending to be non-coercive. But again, it is painfully ignorant of modern economic advances. This is 1890s. This is 20 years approximately after the marginal value revolution, and most of the arguments that he's making are they sound nice, but if you actually think about them, they don't make a whole lot of sense. So with that, we're going to conclude the conquest of bread. I hope you found this a little bit interesting. I hope that this is a little bit helpful in at least showing that it's worth looking at these ideas just to make sure that there's nothing hidden in them sometimes. But sometimes, it is also true that Mises and Rothbard were just correct. Which is unfortunate, because I was hoping I would find something interesting in here that would actually make it anarcho-communism as opposed to exproprio-communism, or whatever, would be a better word for it. So, with that, I will call it here for today. We will pick something else up later in the week, I hope. Try to figure something out. And I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your week.